Elijah Washington sat quietly in first-class seat 1A, observing as Karen Mitchell stormed down the aisle. Her eyes narrowed at his casual jeans and t-shirt. "You're in my seat," she announced loudly. Flight attendants exchanged glances. Elijah smiled calmly. "Actually, ma'am, I own this airline." Her face froze in shock. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to catch more unbelievable true stories of people getting exactly what they deserve. Now, let's see what happened next when this entitled passenger met her match. Elijah Washington hadn't always been the billionaire CEO of skybound airlines. At 45, his salt and pepper beard and relaxed demeanor masked the intense drive that had propelled him from a small apartment in South Chicago to the pinnacle of the aviation industry. 20 years ago, Skybound had been nothing but a business plan repeatedly rejected by investors who couldn't envision a black man succeeding in an industry dominated by white executives. But today, Skybound was the fastest-growing airline in North America, known for exceptional service and industry-leading customer satisfaction. Despite his success, Elijah never forgot his roots or the countless times he'd been judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. This was why once every month Elijah Washington went undercover. He called these his secret passenger flights, opportunities to experience his airline exactly as customers did, without the special treatment that inevitably came with recognition. On these days, he'd trade his tailored suits for jeans and a plain black t-shirt, leave his executive credentials at home, and carry only his personal ID and a company card that didn't advertise his position. This Thursday morning had begun like any other undercover day. Elijah had woken at his Atlanta home, deliberately chosen his most casual clothing, and called his regular Uber driver rather than his company car. He'd selected Flight SB 247 to San Francisco specifically because it was one of their busier routes with a diverse customer base. "You sure about this outfit, sir?" his housekeeper, Mrs. Bennett, had asked skeptically as he headed out the door. "You look like you're going to a baseball game, not running a company." "That's exactly the point," Mrs. B. Elijah had replied with a wink. "Nobody looks twice at a black man in jeans." At the airport, Elijah had moved through security like any other passenger, standing in line, removing his shoes, enduring the extra random screening that somehow seemed to happen every time he flew incognito. The TSA agent had studied his ID a beat longer than necessary, glancing between the photo and his face with thinly veiled suspicion. Jasmine Rodriguez, a senior flight attendant who had been with Skybound since its early days, was one of the few employees who knew about Elijah's undercover flights. As he boarded, she greeted him just like any other first-class passenger professionally, but without recognition. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard Flight 247 to San Francisco. May I help you find your seat?" "Thank you, Jasmine," he replied quietly. "I know where I'm going." She gave him a subtle nod, the briefest acknowledgement of their shared secret. Jasmine was essential to these missions. She would observe the crew's performance without alerting them to the CEO's presence. Elijah settled into seat 1A, his favorite spot for observation. From here, he could watch the boarding process, monitor how his staff interacted with passengers, and get a true feel for the Skybound experience. He pulled out a dog-eared paperback, a biography of Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman to earn a pilot's license, and began to read. The first-class cabin filled gradually with the usual mix of business travelers, in crisp suits, tapping impatiently on laptops before the plane even left the ground. Several glanced at Elijah with momentary confusion, the unspoken question evident in their expressions. Does he belong here? It was a look he knew well, had experienced in luxury stores, high-end restaurants, and valet stands throughout his life. Then came the dramatic entrance that would change the course of the day. Karen Mitchell strode onto the plane with the confidence of someone who expected the world to accommodate her. In her designer white linen suit and pearls, her blonde hair cut in an expensive bob, she carried herself with the air of a woman accustomed to getting her way. She barked instructions at the flight attendant, helping an elderly man stow his luggage, and checked her boarding pass with an exaggerated sigh. As her gaze swept across the first-class cabin and landed on Elijah, her expression shifted from impatience to something darker. Her eyes narrowed, her lips tightened, and she clutched her designer handbag a little closer to her body. Elijah had seen that look hundreds of times before. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Karen Mitchell marched down the aisle, her Louis Vuitton carry-on trailing behind her. She stopped directly beside Elijah's seat, hovering over him with a look of absolute certainty that she was about to correct a mistake. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the boarding process. "I believe you're in my seat." Elijah looked up from his book calmly and smiled. "Good morning. Actually, I checked my boarding pass when I sat down. This is 1A. Karen's nostrils flared slightly as she thrust her boarding pass toward his face. "Well, I have 1A right here. There must be some mistake." Elijah took out his own boarding pass and compared the two. "Mine says 1A as well. Perhaps there was a system error. I'd be happy to have a flight attendant sort it out." Something in Karen's expression hardened as though she'd just made an internal calculation about the situation and about Elijah. "I always sit in 1A on this flight. I'm a Platinum Elite member." She emphasized the status level as if it granted her sovereignty over the aircraft. "I'm sure you've just made a mistake." The subtext was clear. You don't belong here. Elijah had been in this position before too many times to count. The assumptions people made about him based on his skin color had followed him from childhood through the Harvard Business School and into the boardrooms where he'd fought to build Skybound. He maintained his composure, a skill honed through years of being the only black man in rooms full of skeptical white faces. "I understand the confusion," he said evenly. "Let's get some help sorting this out." Other first-class passengers had begun to notice the confrontation. A middle-aged white man in 1B glanced up from his Wall Street Journal, then quickly looked away. A woman across the aisle pretended to be deeply engaged with the safety card. No one intervened their silence, a familiar soundtrack to Elijah's experiences with discrimination. Jasmine approached with professional concern. "Is there a problem here?" Karen immediately turned to her relief, evident in her expression at finding someone she deemed more authoritative than Elijah. "Yes, there's been a mix-up with the seating. This gentleman is in my seat." The way she emphasized gentleman made it sound like an insult. Jasmine checked both boarding passes, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the duplicate assignment. This wasn't part of Elijah's usual undercover plan. "I see the issue, ma'am. Let me check the system." As Jasmine stepped away to her tablet, Karen's attention returned to Elijah, her patience visibly thinning. "I'm sure they'll sort this out quickly. I always sit in 1A. It's my preferred seat." Elijah nodded politely, but made no move to get up. "I understand. We'll let the staff resolve it." Karen's face flushed slightly. "Look, I have a connection to make in San Francisco. I'm sure there are plenty of other seats available." Her eyes flicked to the economy section behind them. "I need this specific seat for my comfort." The implication hung in the air. Surely you can move. Surely your comfort matters less than mine. Elijah felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a feeling that had accompanied him through countless moments like this. He thought back to the time a security guard had followed him around a high-end watch store while ignoring white customers, to the taxi drivers who had driven past him to pick up white passengers, to the real estate agent who had shown him only properties in certain neighborhoods until he'd mentioned his position as CEO. "I'm happy to move if there's been a mistake," Elijah said, maintaining his calm, "but I'd like to see what the system says first." Karen's patience snapped. "This is ridiculous. I don't have time for this." She turned toward the front of the plane and raised her voice. "Can I speak to someone in charge, please? Someone who can actually solve problems?" The conversation had now drawn the attention of everyone in first class. The tension was palpable, uncomfortable. A few passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats. Jasmine returned her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes communicating apology to Elijah. "Ma'am, there does appear to be a duplicate assignment. This happens occasionally with our system. Since the gentleman was seated first, our protocol is to—" "Protocol," Karen interrupted. "Do you know who I am? I spend thousands of dollars with this airline every month. I'm not going to be inconvenienced because of a computer error and some—" She paused, looking Elijah up and down, some guy who clearly got upgraded or something. The "or something" carried the weight of her assumption that a black man in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class legitimately. Elijah had remained silent, observing not just Karen, but the reactions of his staff and other passengers. This was valuable information for his company, albeit painfully acquired. "Ma'am," Jasmine tried again. "I can offer you 2A, which is identical to this seat but on the other side." "This is unacceptable," Karen said sharply. "Get your supervisor. Now." "I am the senior flight attendant on this flight," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. Karen scoffed. "Then get the captain. Or security. This man needs to move to his proper seat." She looked directly at Elijah. "Listen, boy, I don't know how you ended up here, but this has gone on long enough." The word "boy" fell like a stone in the cabin. Several passengers gasped audibly. Jasmine's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing shock and anger. For Elijah, time seemed to slow down. Boy. A word with centuries of degradation behind it. A word that had been used to diminish black men, regardless of their age, accomplishments, or character. A word that revealed exactly what Karen thought of him. He felt the eyes of every passenger, the uncomfortable silence, the weight of this moment. He could address it directly, could explain to Karen exactly why her words were so deeply offensive. He could reveal his identity and watch her world collapse around her. Or he could stay silent, absorb this indignity as he had so many others for the sake of observing how his company handled such situations. Before he could decide, another flight attendant hurried over. Bradley Thompson was young, white, and clearly disturbed by the commotion in first class during boarding. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, looking between Karen and Jasmine. Karen immediately turned to him with visible relief. "Finally, someone who can handle this. This man is in my seat, and no one seems capable of resolving the situation." Bradley looked uncertainly at Jasmine, then at Elijah, then at the boarding passes. "Sir, it seems there's been a mistake. Would you mind moving to another seat so we can get everyone settled for takeoff?" The speed with which Bradley had sided with Karen, without fully assessing the situation, without respecting Jasmine's authority, without considering that Elijah might legitimately belong in that seat, told Elijah everything he needed to. "No. Actually," Karen said, her voice rising, "I want him removed from first class entirely. This is completely unacceptable. I want security called immediately." And with that demand, Elijah Washington, founder and CEO of Skybound Airlines, decided it was time to end his undercover mission for the day. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. Other passengers were shifting uncomfortably, some pretending to be absorbed in their phones, others watching the drama unfold with uncomfortable fascination. The confrontation had become impossible to ignore. Jasmine Rodriguez stood caught between her duty to her boss and her obligation to follow normal protocol without revealing Elijah's identity. Her dark eyes flashed with indignation at Bradley's quick dismissal of her authority, but her professional training kept her voice steady. "Bradley," she said quietly, "I was handling this situation." Bradley Thompson barely acknowledged her, his attention focused on appeasing the increasingly irate Karen Mitchell. "I understand this is frustrating, ma'am. We'll get this sorted out immediately." He turned to Elijah with a practiced customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me so we can find you appropriate seating." The assumption was clear. Elijah didn't belong in first class. No investigation. No consideration that he might be right. Just an immediate judgment based on appearances. Elijah observed Bradley carefully. This was valuable information about his company's culture. Uncomfortable, disappointing information, but valuable nonetheless. He noted how quickly Bradley had undermined Jasmine, how readily he'd assumed Karen was in the right, how automatically he'd decided that Elijah was the one who needed to move. For a moment, Elijah considered continuing the charade, allowing himself to be relocated to economy, watching how the situation would play out if he were truly just a passenger. There would be value in that experience too. But Karen's next words made the decision for him. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, loudly addressing Bradley while pointing at Elijah. "You need better security measures to keep people in their proper places." "I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing when I pay for premium service." Proper places. The phrase hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Elijah stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding until he was looking down at both Karen and Bradley. The cabin seemed to go completely still. "Bradley," he said calmly, "could you please radio Captain Davies and let him know that Elijah Washington is on board?" Bradley's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sir, I don't see how that's relevant to—" "Just do it, please," Elijah said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped him build a billion-dollar company. Something in his tone made Bradley hesitate. Yes, sir. One moment." He stepped away to use the cabin phone, still looking confused. Karen crossed her arms, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is—" Elijah reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it he extracted not the standard skybound frequent flyer card that millions of customers carried, but a sleek black card with his photograph and the embossed gold words, "Elijah Washington, Founder and Chief Executive Officer." He held it up without a word. Karen's eyes widened. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face so rapidly that for a moment Elijah was concerned she might faint. "You're—" she finally managed to stammer. "Yes," Elijah said simply. "I am." The revelation rippled through the first-class cabin. A passenger across the aisle who had been pretending to be engrossed in a magazine let out an audible, "Oh my God." The businessman in 1B suddenly seemed deeply interested in the view out the window, clearly mortified at having witnessed the entire exchange without intervening. Bradley returned at that moment, his expression transformed from confusion to horror as he saw the ID card in Elijah's hand. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I am so sorry. I didn't realize." "It's fine, Bradley," Elijah said calmly, though it wasn't fine at all. "I fly incognito occasionally to experience our service firsthand. It's been instructive." Jasmine, who had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, now allowed herself a small, vindicated smile. "Would you like me to find another seat for Miss Mitchell, Mr. Washington?" Before Elijah could answer, the cabin door opened again and Captain Marcus Davies entered. Unlike Bradley, Davies recognized Elijah immediately, despite the casual clothes. "Mr. Washington," he said, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Always an honor to have you on board, sir." The captain was an early hire at Skybound, a former Air Force pilot who had joined when the airline had only 2 planes in its fleet. He had earned Elijah's respect through his professionalism and fairness, and the feeling was clearly mutual. Marcus Elijah acknowledged with a nod. "Good to see you. We've had a bit of a seating confusion." Captain Davies surveyed the scene, quickly assessing the situation. "I see. Can I help resolve things?" Karen Mitchell, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly seemed to find her voice and a rapid change in demeanor. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," she said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I had no idea that I owned the airline," Elijah finished for her, "or that a black man in jeans could legitimately be seated in first class." The bluntness of the question left Karen speechless again. Captain Davies looked between them, understanding dawning on his face. "Miss Mitchell," Elijah continued, his voice level but firm, "I'd like to speak with you, along with Bradley and Jasmine, after we land in San Francisco. I think we have some important things to discuss about the customer experience on Skybound." Karen nodded mutely, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "For now," Elijah said, turning to Jasmine, "please help Miss Mitchell find her actual assigned seat. I believe she's in 2C, according to the system." He glanced at Karen. "Not 1A. Never 1A, despite what you told everyone." The revelation that Karen had lied about her assigned seat added another layer to the uncomfortable silence in the cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the drama unfold, no longer pretending to be absorbed in their devices or magazines. And Bradley Elijah added, "I'd like you to stay up front for a moment. We need to clarify some company policies." As Jasmine led a visibly shaken Karen Mitchell toward her actual seat, Elijah turned to Captain Davies. "Marcus, I'd appreciate it if you could make a note in the flight log about this incident. I'll be calling an executive meeting when we land." "Of course, sir," the captain replied. "Anything else you need?" Elijah shook his head. "Just a smooth flight to San Francisco." And perhaps, he added with the faintest smile, a reminder to our team about Skybound's core values. As Captain Davies returned to the cockpit and Bradley stood awkwardly awaiting his conversation with the CEO, Elijah Washington settled back into seat 1A. He'd come aboard to observe the customer experience on his airline. He'd certainly gotten more insight than he had bargained for. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was charged with awkward tension as the plane taxied toward the runway. Karen Mitchell sat rigidly in her actual assigned seat 2C, staring straight ahead and avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Her face had settled into a mask of mortification, the remnants of her outrage now replaced by the dawning realization of what she had done and to whom. Elijah Washington remained in seat 1A, watching the activity around him with keen, observant eyes. After a brief but pointed conversation with Bradley about company values and implicit bias, he had dismissed the young flight attendant to his regular duties. Now, as the engines roared to life and the plane began its takeoff roll, Elijah found himself processing the emotions of the past 30 minutes. Would this incident have played out differently if he'd been dressed in an expensive suit? If he'd been white? The questions weren't really questions at all. He knew the answers with the certainty that came from a lifetime of similar experiences. As the plane lifted off the ground, banking over the sprawling cityscape of Atlanta, Elijah's mind drifted back to the earliest days of Skybound Airlines. He had been 32, armed with an MBA from Harvard, 5 years of experience at a major airline and a business plan that industry experts had called revolutionary. What he hadn't had was funding. One venture capital firm after another had turned him down, their rejections wrapped in polite corporate language that couldn't quite conceal the underlying message. They couldn't envision a black man at the helm of a major airline. The aviation industry has certain traditions, one investor had told him leaning back in his leather chair. Customers have expectations about who they see in uniform, who's making announcements from the cockpit. It's nothing personal, it's just business. Another had been more blunt. Look, Elijah, you're clearly brilliant, but this is a billion-dollar industry with entrenched players. Maybe start smaller, a regional charter service focusing on, urban areas. Translation, stay in your lane. The breakthrough had come from Evelyn Hargrove, a widowed heiress with a reputation for backing unconventional entrepreneurs. The industry needs disruption, she had said after reading his business plan. And you're just the disruptor it needs. With her initial investment of $20 million, Skybound had acquired its first 2 planes and established routes between 5 major cities. The early years had been a constant struggle, not just against the financial challenges any startup faced, but against the persistent undercurrent of racism that seemed built into the industry's foundation. Major airports had been reluctant to grant gate space. Established airlines had slashed prices on competing routes to squeeze the newcomer out. Industry publications had scrutinized Skybound's every move, ready to declare the experiment a failure. Yet somehow they had survived. More than survived, thrived. Skybound's customer-first approach and innovative pricing model had attracted a loyal following. 5 years in, they had expanded to 20 planes and 30 destinations. 10 years in, they had gone public in a wildly successful IPO. And now, 15 years after that first investment, Skybound was an industry leader with a fleet of over 100 aircraft and routes spanning the globe. Through it all, Elijah had maintained his practice of flying incognito, experiencing his airline, as customers did. It had kept him grounded, connected to the real passenger experience in a way other CEOs weren't. And it had led to countless improvements in Skybound's service. But it had also exposed him to moments like today's painful reminders that no amount of success could fully shield him from the reality of being a black man in America. The plane reached its cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin crew began their service preparations. Jasmine moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, though Elijah noticed she was giving both him and Karen a wide berth, unsure how to navigate the uncomfortable dynamic. Around him, the other first-class passengers were now treating him with an almost comical deference. The businessman in 1B, who had studiously ignored the earlier confrontation, now seemed desperate to engage. "Remarkable job you've done with Skybound, sir," he said, leaning across the armrest. I fly over 100,000 miles a year and your airline is by far the best. Another passenger stopped in the aisle on the way to the lavatory. Mr. Washington, I just want to say how much I admire what you've built. My daughter did a school project on you last year. You're such an inspiration. Elijah acknowledged their comments with polite nods, acutely aware of the irony. The same people who had sat silently during his humiliation were now falling over themselves to be associated with his success. So I have to ask, what would you have done in Elijah's situation? Would you have revealed your identity right away, or kept your cool like he did? Comment number 1 if you think Elijah handled it perfectly, or number 2 if you would have put Karen in her place immediately. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying this real-life drama, and subscribe for more incredible stories of justice served. But what happened next? As turbulence began to rock the aircraft both literally and figuratively, Elijah was about to make a decision that would transform not just this flight, but the entire culture of the company he'd built from nothing. The question is, was he about to make things better or worse? Once the plane reached its cruising altitude and the flight attendants completed their initial service, Elijah Washington unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The motion drew immediate attention from the first-class passengers, many of whom were still stealing glances at the airline CEO they had watched being racially profiled less than an hour ago. He made his way to the galley where Bradley Thompson was organizing drink service, deliberately avoiding eye contact with his boss. The young flight attendant stiffened as Elijah approached. "Mr. Washington, I want to apologize again for—" Elijah raised a hand to stop him. "Bradley, I'd like to have a conversation with you." "Not here. Is there somewhere more private we can talk?" Bradley swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. We can use the rear galley. It's quiet right now, while everyone's settling in." They made their way to the back of the plane, passing through the premium economy and economy cabins. Elijah noted how passengers reacted to his presence, the double takes, the whispers behind hands, the nudging of seatmates. News of his identity had clearly spread throughout the aircraft. In the rear galley, Bradley stood at attention like a soldier awaiting disciplinary action. Elijah gestured for him to relax. "I'm not here to fire you," Elijah said, getting straight to the point. "I'm here to understand what happened and why." Relief flooded Bradley's face, followed immediately by shame. "Sir, I made a terrible assumption. There's no excuse for it." "Actually, I think there might be," Elijah replied, his voice calm but serious. "And I need to know what it is. This isn't just about you, Bradley. It's about Skybound, about the culture we've created or failed to create." Bradley's eyes darted around the galley as if seeking an escape route. Finding none, he took a deep breath. "Honestly, sir, it's not the first time something like this has happened." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "Go on." There's a kind of unwritten rule among some of the crew. Not everyone," Bradley quickly added, "but enough. When there's a dispute between passengers, we're supposed to side with the one who looks like they belong in first class. And what exactly does someone who belongs in first class look like, Bradley?" The young man's face flushed red. "You know, business types. Well-dressed. Usually." He trailed off. "Usually," white Elijah finished for him. Bradley nodded miserably. "It's not official policy or anything. It's just what we're expected to do. What we're rewarded for doing." "Rewarded by whom?" "Supervisors. Senior crew. They say it's about minimizing conflicts and keeping the high-value customers happy." Elijah felt a weight settling in his chest, the familiar burden of discovering that racism had infiltrated something he had built despite his best efforts to prevent it. "And Jasmine," he asked, "where does she stand on this unwritten rule?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "She's one of the good ones. She fights it. That's why He stopped again. "That's why you undermined her," Elijah finished. "Because she was following actual company policy instead of this shadow policy." Bradley nodded, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. "I need to see something," Elijah said, pulling out his tablet. "I want you to log into the crew portal for me." Bradley hesitated only briefly before entering his credentials. Elijah navigated to the internal reporting system, a platform he had personally championed to allow staff to document and address customer service issues. Show me if there are any reports about racial profiling or discrimination. With obvious reluctance, Bradley filtered the reports and turned the tablet back to Elijah. The screen showed 0 results. That's not right, Bradley said, frowning. I know Jasmine has filed at least 3 reports in the past year alone. Elijah's brow furrowed. Show me how to check archived or deleted reports. After a few more taps, a different screen appeared, this one showing dozens of reports, all filed by Jasmine Rodriguez and a handful of other crew members, all marked resolved with minimal documentation. Who closed these reports? Elijah asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Bradley pointed to a column showing a supervisor's ID. Mark Winters. He's the regional customer service director. Elijah recalled Winters, a middle-aged white man who had come to Skybound from a legacy airline 5 years ago, bringing what had seemed at the time like valuable industry experience. He had risen quickly through the ranks, earning praise for his ability to handle difficult situations discreetly. Now Elijah wondered exactly what that meant. And this deletion of reports, is this common knowledge among the crew? Bradley nodded slowly. It's why most people don't bother reporting anymore. The message is pretty clear. Certain types of complaints aren't welcome. Elijah began scrolling through the buried reports, reading details of incidents disturbingly similar to what he had just experienced. Black passengers in premium cabins being questioned about their seating, asked to show boarding passes multiple times, or relocated to accommodate complaints from white passengers. With each report, his anger deepened, not just at the incidents themselves, but at the realization that they had been happening under his watch, in his company, while he remained unaware. He pulled up the customer complaint database next and ran a search for similar incidents. The results were even more disturbing. Hundreds of complaints from passengers of color describing discriminatory treatment, most marked resolved with generic apology, emails, and vouchers for future travel. This is systemic. Elijah murmured more to himself than to Bradley. Sir Bradley asked hesitantly. Elijah looked up, his expression grave. Bradley, I built this airline with a very specific vision. Equal treatment and respect for every passenger was the foundation of everything we do. Somewhere along the way, that vision got corrupted. And I need to know how deep this problem goes. Bradley seemed to make a decision, straightening his shoulders. Mr. Washington, if you're serious about addressing this, you should know it's not just crew behavior. There are patterns in how we schedule flights, how we allocate resources to different routes, even how we train new hires. Elijah tapped on his tablet, sending a secure message to his executive team. Emergency meeting required upon landing SF. Clear schedules. Topic: Systemic discrimination within Skybound operations. Supporting data to follow. The response was immediate, a flurry of surprised acknowledgments from his leadership team. Elijah suspected many of them were about to be just as blindsided as he had been. Bradley, I need names. Who else in the company has been trying to address these issues? Who's been silencing them? I want to know everyone involved at every level. As Bradley began detailing the complex web of problematic policies and the people behind them, Elijah felt a strange mixture of emotions. Rage at what had been happening, shame at his failure to prevent it, and a growing determination to make it right. His secret passenger flights had always revealed areas for improvement in Skybound's service. But this time, his experience had uncovered something far more serious, a cancer growing within the company culture he had worked so hard to build. And like any cancer, it needed to be cut out completely. Halfway through the flight to San Francisco, as flight attendants distributed lunch service to the first-class cabin, Karen Mitchell rose from her seat in 2C. Her complexion had regained some of its color, though her hands still betrayed a slight tremor as she smoothed her white linen suit. With visible effort, she squared her shoulders and made her way toward Elijah Washington in seat 1A. The other passengers tracked her movement with undisguised interest, many pausing mid-bite to observe the approaching confrontation. Jasmine, who was serving drinks nearby, positioned herself strategically within earshot, ready to intervene if necessary. Elijah noticed Karen's approach, but continued reviewing the disturbing data he had uncovered on his tablet. Only when she stopped directly beside his seat did he look up, his expression neutral. Mr. Washington, Karen began, her voice pitched low enough that only those in immediate proximity could hear. I wanted to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Elijah set his tablet down and gave her his full attention, saying nothing. Karen's discomfort with his silence was evident as she continued. I fly frequently for business, and sometimes the travel stress gets to me. I didn't mean to cause such a scene. Still, Elijah waited. Anyway, she pressed on, increasingly flustered by his lack of response. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry if I came across as impolite. That's not who I am. I have many black colleagues. My children's pediatrician is black, actually. But today, Skybound was the fastest-growing airline in North America, known for exceptional service and industry-leading customer satisfaction. Despite his success, Elijah never forgot his roots, or the countless times he'd been judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. Karen blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yes, what else would there be? Perhaps an acknowledgement of what actually happened. Elijah suggested, his voice level but firm. You didn't just create a scene or act impolitely. You made specific assumptions about me based solely on my appearance. You lied about your assigned seat to try to displace me. You called me boy in front of a plane full of people. Karen's face flushed. That's not fair. How was I supposed to know someone like you owned an airline? Someone like me, Elijah repeated. And what exactly am I like Miss Mitchell? The trap had been laid, and Karen had walked straight into it. Her eyes widened as she realized her mistake. I think we both know what you meant, Elijah interrupted. And that's precisely the problem. You didn't see Elijah Washington, CEO. You saw a black man in casual clothes and immediately decided I didn't belong in first class. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times as she searched for a response. You have to understand, it's not personal. It's just there's a certain profile of people you expect to see in premium cabins. And that profile doesn't include people who look like me. Well, not dressed like that, Karen said, gesturing to his jeans and t-shirt. It's about presentation, not race. A quiet voice came from across the aisle. That's not true. Both Elijah and Karen turned to see a young black man in a perfectly tailored Navy suit who had been quietly observing their exchange. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a Skybound Gold member. I fly first class at least twice a month, and I get asked to verify my seat on almost every flight, even in a suit and tie. My white colleagues never do. His statement hung in the air, creating a ripple of uncomfortable awareness throughout the cabin. Then another voice joined in. Same here, said an Asian woman a few rows back. I've been asked to move to my real seat in economy more times than I can count, even when I'm the first one on the plane. From economy class, a Latino man in business casual attire leaned into the aisle. I'm a Skybound flight attendant, deadheading back to base. Last month, a passenger complained to my colleague about me being seated in premium economy while I was in uniform. One by one, passengers began sharing similar experiences, moments of prejudice experienced while flying, not just on Skybound, but across the industry. The cabin became a spontaneous forum on racial bias, with voices from various backgrounds contributing their perspectives. Karen Mitchell stood frozen in the aisle, her planned apology derailed by this unexpected turn of events. Her discomfort was palpable as she found herself at the center of a conversation about systemic racism that she had inadvertently triggered. This is getting out of hand, she finally said, raising her voice over the ongoing discussion. I came to apologize, not to be ambushed with accusations of racism. Yet when given the opportunity to apologize sincerely, you chose to defend your assumptions instead, Elijah observed. You're not sorry for what you did, you're sorry for who you did it to. Karen's face hardened. You have no idea what I'm sorry for. You don't know me at all. You're right, Elijah agreed. I don't know you, just as you didn't know me when you made your judgments earlier. The difference is that I'm not claiming to know your character, only responding to your actions. Jasmine checked both boarding passes, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the duplicate assignment. This wasn't part of Elijah's usual undercover plan. I see the issue, ma'am. Let me check the system. Miss Mitchell, Elijah said calmly, no one is against you. We're having a necessary conversation about behaviors that need to change in our airline and in society. You have a choice. You can be part of that conversation, or you can continue to deny there's a problem. Karen looked around at the faces. watching her, some sympathetic, others challenging, all attentive. Whatever she saw there seemed to overwhelm her. Without another word, she turned and hurried back to her seat, pulling the privacy divider closed behind her. As the spontaneous discussion continued around him, Elijah observed the dynamic with keen interest. What had begun as a personal confrontation had evolved into something more significant. A collective acknowledgement of a shared experience, an impromptu community forming around the recognition of injustice. He noticed Bradley watching from the galley, his expression a mixture of shame and revelation as he listened to passenger after passenger describe experiences that his unwritten rules had enabled. Jasmine caught Elijah's eye and gave him a subtle nod of approval. This perhaps was the most valuable outcome of his undercover flight, not just exposing the problem, but creating space for the voices of those affected by it. As the plane began its initial descent toward San Francisco, Elijah made notes on his tablet outlining immediate changes needed at Skybound. This incident with Karen Mitchell, painful as it had been, might prove to be exactly the catalyst his company needed. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom as the plane began its final approach into San Francisco International Airport. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Elijah Washington stowed his tablet in the seat pocket and gazed out the window at the fog-shrouded Bay Area coming into view. His mind was still processing everything he had learned during the flight, not just about Karen Mitchell's prejudice, but about the pervasive culture of discrimination that had taken root within his own company. As the plane dipped lower, cutting through cloud layers, Elijah found himself thinking about Charles Parker, the first person who had truly believed in him when he was struggling to launch Skybound. Charles had been an unlikely mentor, a 70-year-old retired airline executive who had spent decades navigating the overwhelmingly white male aviation industry. Their paths had crossed at an industry conference, where Elijah, then in his early 30s, had been trying unsuccessfully to network with potential investors. "You've got something none of these old dinosaurs have," Charles had told him over drinks at the hotel bar. "Vision. But vision alone won't get you through those doors." He had nodded toward a group of airline executives laughing together across the room. "What will?" Elijah had asked. "Persistence beyond reason," Charles had replied. "They're counting on you to give up after the first dozen rejections, or the first 100 slights. They expect you to accept that this isn't your world. Your job is to prove them wrong every single day until they can't ignore you anymore." That advice had sustained Elijah through the early years of building Skybound, through the meetings where investors spoke only to his white deputy, through the industry events where he was mistaken for catering staff, through the endless, subtle and not so subtle reminders that he was an outsider in the aviation establishment. But somewhere along the way, as Skybound had grown from scrappy startup to industry player, as Elijah himself had transitioned from hustling entrepreneur to respected CEO, he had perhaps become too removed from the everyday reality of his company's operations. His undercover flights had shown him the customer experience, yes, but they hadn't revealed how his own employees were perpetuating the very discrimination he had fought against throughout his career. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built Skybound partly as a response to the exclusionary practices of legacy airlines, determined to create a company where everyone, passengers and employees alike, would be treated with equal respect, regardless of their background. Yet here, he was discovering that bias had infiltrated his creation despite his best intentions. The plane descended further, the city grid becoming more distinct. Below, Elijah noticed subtle differences in how the cabin crew was now interacting with passengers, a heightened self-consciousness in their behavior, especially when addressing passengers of color. Word had clearly spread throughout the crew about what had transpired in first class. Captain Davies's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." As the announcement played, Elijah observed Jasmine Rodriguez moving efficiently through the cabin, checking seatbelts and tray tables. Despite the uncomfortable situation she had been placed in, she had maintained her professionalism throughout the flight. She caught his eye briefly as she passed his seat, and he gave her a small nod of appreciation. His phone, switched to airplane mode, contained dozens of messages from his executive team responding to his call for an emergency meeting. He could already imagine their reactions. Some would be genuinely shocked and concerned, others defensive about practices that had developed under their watch. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the plane began its taxi toward the terminal. Elijah found himself scrutinizing every aspect of the arrival process with new eyes, noting which passengers the crew addressed first, who received offers of assistance with baggage, whose questions were answered most thoroughly. As they approached the gate, he opened his notebook app and drafted a quick message to be sent to his entire company once he had network access. Today, I experienced Skybound not as your CEO but as a passenger, subjected to discrimination on one of our own flights. This incident has revealed serious issues within our culture that contradict our core values and mission. I am calling for an immediate company-wide audit of our practices, policies, and training. We will address these issues transparently and thoroughly, starting today. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. As passengers began the usual rush to retrieve luggage and exit, Elijah remained seated watching. He noticed security personnel waiting in the jet bridge, not unusual for a high-profile passenger, but these weren't his regular security detail. Captain Davies emerged from the cockpit and approached Elijah's seat. "Mr. Washington, your executive team sent additional security to escort you to the meeting. They're waiting just outside." Elijah nodded, appreciating the discretion and efficiency with which his team had responded. "Thank you, Marcus. I'd like to ask a favor, though." "Of course, sir." "Would you ensure that Miss Mitchell, Bradley Thompson, and Jasmine Rodriguez remain on board after other passengers have deplaned? I need to speak with them before my meeting." The captain nodded. "I'll make it happen." As the regular passengers filed out, many nodded respectfully to Elijah or murmured words of support as they passed. The young black man in the Navy suit paused briefly. "Mr. Washington, I just want to say that what you're doing matters, not just to your customers, but to everyone who's ever been made to feel they don't belong somewhere." Elijah stood and shook his hand. "Thank you. I'd like to hear more about your experiences with our airline, if you're willing to share them." The man nodded. "Absolutely. Anything that helps make things better." They exchanged contact information, and the man continued down the aisle, leaving Elijah with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one incident or one airline. It was about challenging the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that racism continued to shape everyday experiences. As the last regular passenger deplaned, Elijah noticed Karen Mitchell shifting uncomfortably in her seat, clearly aware that she had been asked to stay behind. Bradley stood nervously in the galley, while Jasmine maintained her professional composure despite the unusual situation. The moment of reckoning had arrived not just for Karen, whose prejudice had been on full display, but for Skybound Airlines and the culture Elijah had built. It was time to ensure that the company truly lived up to the values it claimed to embody. The cabin was eerily quiet, with all the regular passengers gone. Only 5 people remained: Elijah Washington, Karen Mitchell, Bradley Thompson, Jasmine Rodriguez, and Captain Marcus Davies. The usual post-landing bustle of cleaning crews had been temporarily delayed at Elijah's request, giving them a brief window of privacy. Elijah chose a row of seats in the middle of the first-class cabin and gestured for everyone to join him. "Please sit down. What I have to say won't take long, but it's important." Karen Mitchell looked as if she'd rather be anywhere else, her earlier haughtiness replaced by visible anxiety. Bradley's face was etched with the anticipation of consequences, while Jasmine maintained the calm professionalism that had characterized her throughout the flight. Captain Davies stood slightly apart, present, but allowing Elijah to lead the conversation. "First, I want to thank you all for staying," Elijah began, his voice measured. "What happened today matters not just to me personally, but to Skybound as a company and to everyone who flies with us." He turned to Bradley. "Bradley, I'd like you to explain to everyone here why you acted the way you did during the initial seating dispute." The young flight attendant swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Elijah and Karen. "Sir, I followed what I thought was expected of me. There's an unofficial practice among some crew to give the benefit of the doubt to passengers who look like they belong in premium cabins." "And what does someone who belongs look like?" Elijah pressed. Bradley's face flushed. "Usually white, well-dressed. The assumption is that they're more likely to be high-value customers. Karen shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Jasmine Elijah continued, "You've been with Skybound almost since the beginning. In your experience, how pervasive is this unofficial practice?" Jasmine sat up straighter. "It's common, Mr. Washington. Not universal, many crew members refuse to participate, but common enough that it affects passenger experiences regularly. I've filed numerous reports about discriminatory incidents, but—" She hesitated. "But they were buried," Elijah finished for her. "I saw the archived reports today, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for your persistence in documenting these issues, even when it seemed no one was listening." He turned to Karen Mitchell, whose eyes were now fixed on her expensive handbag. "Miss Mitchell, I'm not here to publicly shame you, but I do want you to understand something important." Karen looked up reluctantly. "When you boarded this flight and saw me in that seat, you made immediate assumptions based solely on my appearance. Those assumptions weren't random or innocent. They were the product of deeply ingrained biases about who deserves respect and who doesn't, about who belongs in certain spaces and who doesn't." "I wasn't," Karen began to protest, but Elijah raised a hand. "Before you respond, I want you to know that I recorded our entire interaction, including your follow-up apology. It's standard practice on my undercover flights to document the customer experience." Karen's face paled. "You can't. That's an invasion of privacy. Actually, our terms of service, which you agreed to when purchasing your ticket, clearly state that all customer interactions may be recorded for quality control purposes." "But that's beside the point." Elijah pulled out his tablet. "What I want to show you is something more important." He tapped the screen a few times and turned it toward her, displaying a collection of customer complaints. "These are reports from passengers who've had experiences similar to mine today. Black executives asked to verify their first-class tickets multiple times. Asian doctors assumed to be in the wrong seat. Latino professionals subjected to random security screenings that somehow never seem random." Karen's eyes scanned the screen, her expression unreadable. "This isn't about one incident or one person," Elijah continued. "It's about a pattern that causes real harm to real people every day. People who have earned their success, just as you've earned yours, but who don't receive the same basic respect because of how they look." He turned to include all of them in his gaze. Skybound was founded on the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or how much they paid for their ticket. Somewhere along the way, we've strayed from that vision. Today, we start finding our way back. Captain Davies spoke up for the first time. "What changes will be implemented, sir?" "Immediate ones," Elijah replied firmly. "Starting with a comprehensive review of all customer service protocols, explicit anti-bias training for all staff, and a new executive position focused exclusively on equity in the passenger experience." He turned to Bradley. "As for you, Bradley, I'm not firing you today." Relief washed over the young man's face. But Elijah continued, "Your continued employment with Skybound will depend on your willingness to be part of the solution. I want you to work directly with our training department to document exactly how these bias practices developed and spread. Your inside perspective will be invaluable in rooting them out." Bradley nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. I want to make this right." Elijah turned back to Karen Mitchell. "Miss Mitchell, you have a choice to make as well." She looked up, wariness in her eyes. "What kind of choice?" "The recording of today's incident could easily go public. In the age of social media, I imagine it would be quite damaging to both your personal and professional reputation." Karen's face registered alarm. "You're threatening me." "Not at all. I'm offering you an opportunity. Instead of becoming the latest viral example of prejudice, you could be part of creating meaningful change." How Karen asked skepticism evident in her tone. "Skybound is developing a new passenger sensitivity training program. We need input from people with diverse perspectives." Elijah held her gaze steadily. "Your involvement would provide valuable insight into the assumptions that shape passenger interactions." Karen blinked in surprise. "You want me to help design sensitivity training? After what happened?" "Sometimes the people who have the most to learn also have the most to teach," Elijah said simply. "Your participation would be confidential, of course. The choice is entirely yours." The offer hung in the air between them. For a long moment, Karen said nothing, her expression cycling through confusion, defensiveness, and finally, a reluctant consideration. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Elijah nodded. "That's all I ask." He turned to Jasmine. "Miss Rodriguez, I'd like you to head up our new passenger advocacy department. Your commitment to our core values, even when it wasn't convenient or rewarded, is exactly what Skybound needs right now." Jasmine's professional composure briefly gave way to surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. I would be honored." "Captain Davies," Elijah continued, "I'll be counting on you to help lead the change within our flight operations. Your reputation for fairness is well known among the crew." The captain nodded solemnly. "You can count on me, sir." Elijah stood signaling that the impromptu meeting was drawing to a close. What happened today was painful but necessary. It forced us to confront issues that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. Now it's up to all of us to decide what we do with that knowledge. He looked at each of them in turn, the biased passenger, the complicit employee, the principled whistleblower, the respected leader, all part of a system that needed transformation. "The real test isn't whether we make mistakes or harbor biases," Elijah concluded. "It's whether we have the courage to acknowledge them and the commitment to change. Today is just the beginning of that process for Skybound. I hope each of you will choose to be part of it." With that, he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave for the emergency executive meeting awaiting him. The real work of rebuilding Skybound's culture was about to begin, and it wouldn't be easy. But as he looked back at the 4 people still seated in the cabin, each lost in their own thoughts, Elijah felt something he hadn't expected after such a difficult day: hope. 3 months later, Elijah Washington stood in the Skybound Airlines corporate headquarters in Atlanta, looking out over the city skyline from his corner office. The framed mission statement that had hung on his wall since the company's founding caught his eye. To create an airline where every passenger is treated with equal dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. For years, he had believed Skybound was living those words. The painful incident with Karen Mitchell had revealed how far the company had strayed from its founding vision. But what had begun as a humiliating personal experience had catalyzed the most significant transformation in Skybound's history. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, they're ready for you in the boardroom." "Thank you, Lisa. I'll be right there." Elijah gathered his tablet and the quarterly report he'd been reviewing. The numbers were encouraging, passenger satisfaction scores were up, employee retention had improved, and despite initial concerns from some executives, revenue had remained strong. The company hadn't suffered from taking a bold stance on inclusion. If anything, it had benefited. As he walked through the executive floor, he passed the newly created Office of Passenger Advocacy. Through the glass walls, he could see Jasmine Rodriguez leading a meeting with her team. She had taken to her new role with remarkable skill, implementing a robust system for tracking and addressing discrimination complaints that had already identified several problematic patterns in the company's operations. Karen looked around at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, others challenging, all attentive. Whatever she saw there seemed to overwhelm her. Without another word, she turned and hurried back to her seat, pulling the privacy divider closed behind her. The boardroom fell quiet as Elijah entered. Around the table sat Skybound's leadership team, along with some newer faces, external consultants specializing in organizational culture diversity experts, and representatives from passenger advocacy groups. "Good morning, everyone," Elijah began. "Today marks 3 months since we launched the Skybound Transformation Initiative. I'd like to hear reports from each department on the changes implemented so far." The Chief Operating Officer started. "The new crew training program has been completed by 87% of our frontline staff. Initial feedback has been primarily positive, though there was some resistance from longer-tenured employees." "And how is that resistance being addressed?" Elijah asked. "We're taking a 2-pronged approach. Mandatory follow-up sessions for those who scored low on the assessment, and peer mentorship from crew members who've embraced the changes." Elijah nodded approvingly. "Excellent. And the passenger feedback system?" The head of customer experience pulled up a series of graphs on the main screen. "We've seen a 34% increase in passengers using the new feedback app. More importantly, reports of discriminatory treatment have decreased by 22% since implementation of the new protocols." The meeting continued with each department presenting their progress. The changes hadn't been easy or universally welcomed. Several mid-level managers, including Mark Winters, the customer service director who had been burying discrimination complaints, had either resigned or been let go when they resisted the new direction. Now, Elijah said, as the departmental reports concluded, I'd like to welcome a special guest who's been instrumental in one of our most innovative initiatives. The door opened, and to the surprise of many in the room, Karen Mitchell walked in. She looked different from the entitled, angry woman who had confronted Elijah on that flight 3 months ago. There was a humility in her bearing that hadn't been there before, though she still carried herself with confidence as she took the empty seat Elijah indicated. Miss Mitchell has been co-leading our Customer Perspective program, Elijah explained. Karen, would you like to share your experience with the board? Karen straightened in her chair, meeting the curious gazes around the table. When Mr. Washington first suggested I get involved with Skybound's training program, I thought it was a trap or a punishment. I almost said no. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I've spent my entire career in environments where certain people who look like me, are automatically given credibility and respect. I never had to think about what it might feel like to be constantly questioned, to have your right to occupy space challenged. Karen glanced at Elijah before continuing. Working on this program forced me to confront my own biases in ways that were deeply uncomfortable. I had to listen to stories from people whose experiences were completely different from mine, and I had to acknowledge that I was part of the problem. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing aspects of themselves in Karen's candor. The training modules we've developed don't just lecture employees about what not to do, Karen explained. They create empathy through immersive scenarios based on real passenger experiences. Participants don't just learn about bias, they feel it, and that changes something fundamental in how they approach their work. Elijah noticed the genuine passion in Karen's voice, so different from the defensive anger she'd displayed on the plane. People could change when given the opportunity and motivation. Not everyone would, of course, but enough to matter. After the meeting concluded and the board members filed out, Elijah asked Karen to stay behind for a moment. Thank you for your work these past months, he said sincerely. Your perspective has been invaluable. Karen nodded, a hint of her old confidence returning but tempered with newfound self-awareness. I should be thanking you. Most people would have just exposed the video and destroyed my reputation. You gave me a chance to learn instead. That's what Skybound is about at its best anyway. Second chances and doing better. Will you keep flying incognito? Karen asked. Elijah smiled. Absolutely. In fact, I'm on a flight to Chicago tomorrow, economy class this time. Later that afternoon, Elijah received a notification on his tablet. Bradley Thompson had submitted his latest report from the field. After their confrontation 3 months earlier, Bradley had asked for an opportunity to make amends. Elijah had assigned him to a special project, traveling throughout the Skybound network, identifying instances of bias and documenting them for the training program. Bradley's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising. The young man who had unthinkingly enforced discriminatory unwritten rules had become one of the company's most effective advocates for change precisely because he understood the subtle ways bias operated within the system. His latest report detailed improvements he'd observed in how crew members were handling seating disputes and customer complaints, with specific examples of interventions that had prevented potential discriminatory incidents. It was encouraging progress. The next morning found Elijah boarding a Skybound flight to Chicago, dressed in his usual incognito attire of jeans and a plain t-shirt. He made his way to his economy seat, observing the crew's interactions with passengers along the way. As he settled in, he noticed a flight attendant, someone he didn't recognize, intervening in a situation a few rows ahead. An older white passenger was questioning whether a young South Asian woman was in the correct seat in the Economy Plus section. Ma'am, the flight attendant said firmly to the older passenger, our policy is that all passengers deserve equal respect regardless of appearance. If you have a seating concern, I'm happy to verify both assignments, but I'll need to check yours as well. The older passenger hesitated, then shook her head. No, that's fine. I must have misread my row number. The flight attendant gave a reassuring smile to the young woman before continuing down the aisle. It was a small moment, likely forgotten by everyone involved within minutes. But to Elijah, it represented exactly the kind of transformation he had been working toward. A return to Skybound's original mission, where dignity and respect weren't luxuries reserved for certain passengers, but basic rights, extended to everyone. As the plane took off, climbing through clouds into clear blue sky, Elijah reflected on how sometimes the most painful moments created the most important changes. The humiliation he had experienced that day in Seat 1A had exposed problems that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. In confronting those problems openly and directly, Skybound was becoming a better company not just in its public image, but in its daily operations and fundamental culture. The company still had work to do, of course. Cultural transformation didn't happen in 3 months or even 3 years, but they were on the right path, and Elijah was committed to seeing the journey through. He pulled out his tablet to review some documents for his Chicago meetings, but found himself instead opening a new note and typing a message to be shared with all Skybound employees. True change happens in small moments that no one celebrates or records. It happens when we choose dignity over convenience, respect over assumption, and courage over comfort. I'm proud of the company we're becoming, one decision at a time. As the flight attendants began their service, Elijah closed his tablet and smiled to himself. The most powerful seat on the plane had never been 1A. It was wherever someone chose to stand up for what was right. This story reveals how racial bias persists even in organizations founded on equality. Elijah's experience demonstrates that discrimination isn't just about individual actions, but systemic problems that develop when leaders aren't vigilant. True change requires courage to confront uncomfortable truths and commitment to addressing root causes, not just symptoms. The story teaches us that transformation is possible both personally and organizationally, but requires accountability and consistent effort. Karen's journey shows that people can evolve when given the opportunity to understand the impact of their actions. Bradley's redemption illustrates how those who perpetuate bias can become powerful advocates for change once they recognize their complicity. Most importantly, we learn that leadership means embodying the values you espouse. By experiencing discrimination firsthand and using it as catalyst for change rather than punishment, Elijah demonstrated true leadership, turning pain into progress and creating systems that protect dignity for everyone. What unconscious biases might be affecting your interactions with others? Have you ever been in Elijah's position or Karen's? Drop a comment sharing how you've experienced or witnessed discrimination and what you did about it. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about overcoming injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that confronting discrimination isn't about shame, but growth. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most uncomfortable moments become our greatest opportunities for positive change. Together, we can build a world where everyone receives the dignity they deserve.